Hey everyone, Maria Brañas Morera, as shown here, lived to 117 years old, which is good news because it's pretty close to the longevity world record of 122 years old. Now, as a part of her story, she escaped the major age-related diseases, including cardiovascular disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and Alzheimer's, which then raises the question, what was the cause of death? Now, in this video, I'm going to pitch the hypothesis that it could involve respiratory failure. And note that I'm not the first person to pitch this hypothesis. Tony at the I Am Longevity channel, and I'd encourage everyone to check out this video, it's a brilliant video. Tony pitched the hypothesis that her cause of death may be linked to a loss of motor units in her diaphragm, and then she died in her sleep because she couldn't breathe anymore. So this is a brilliant hypothesis, and I'm not here to mostly rehash that story. I'm here to potentially add to it. Let's do a quick review for how a loss of motor units, specifically to the diaphragm, may impact respiratory failure. So first, during aging, there is a loss of motor units, which is what we'll see here. On the y-axis, we've got the number of motor units, and this is in a muscle located in the upper portion of the foot, plotted against age from birth to around 100 years. And we can see that the number of motor units are approximately stable until around 55 years old, after which there's a steep decline until 100 years old. Now, the importance of that, for why motor units are important, is that without motor units telling the muscle to contract, it will decay. And this is sarcopenia, the age-related loss of muscle mass and function. As Tony so brilliantly says and states on his channel over and over, that motor units, without motor units innervating muscle, we're all screwed. We can escape cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc. But if we don't have motor units, how can we move? How can we breathe? So to illustrate how motor units contribute to muscle contraction, that's what we'll see here. So the signal for contraction starts in the brain with upper motor neurons. And then the signal from the upper motor neurons is transmitted to the spinal cord, which then transmits the signal via lower motor neurons to skeletal muscle, which then tells the muscle to contract. How does motor unit loss impact respiratory failure? So the diaphragm, just like skeletal muscle, is a skeletal muscle, as we can see that it's attached to the rib cage. So muscle attached to bone is a skeletal muscle. And the diaphragm is the main muscle of inspiration. And we can also see that the diaphragm is innervated or connected to the spinal cord by phrenic nerves. Now, phrenic motor neuron numbers decline during aging, which is what we'll see here, with the number of phrenic motor neurons on the y-axis plotted against age in young and old rats. And I should mention the data that I'm going to show, the mechanistic data is in rats and mice. It's obviously easier to isolate motor units and motor neurons from animal models as we can sacrifice and remove the tissues. This is infinitely harder in people. So I'm going to show data in animal model. We can see that the older rats have significantly lower levels of phrenic motor neuron levels when compared with young. Now, the consequence of this is that diaphragm muscle mass and function also decline during aging. First, starting off with the data for diaphragm muscle mass, which is what we'll see here. On the y-axis, we've got mean or average cross-sectional area. And these data are in mice, from young mice, 6 months old, to old mice, 24 months old, in black. And then on the x-axis, we've got muscle fiber type. Type 1, type 2A, type 2X, and or type 2B. The importance of these muscle fiber types is that the type 1 muscles are slow twitch. And then from type 2A and beyond to the right, there's a continuum of faster and then fastest twitch muscle fibers. So what we can see is that in the type 1 and type 2As, there's a trend for lower levels of diaphragm muscle mass in the old mice relative to the young. But these data are not significant. But what we can see is that diaphragm muscle mass is significantly reduced in the older mice when compared with the younger mice, specific to the type 2X and or type 2B muscle fibers. These are the fastest twitch muscle fibers. Now, correspondingly, with a loss of diaphragm muscle mass, there's also a loss of diaphragm muscle function during aging. So on the y-axis, we've got specific force. So this is force production normalized to muscle cross-sectional area. And then we've got two different force production measures. On the left, we've got isometric, and on the right, we've got tetanic. So movement versus no movement and force production. What we can see for both force production measures is that the older diaphragms, the 24-month-old mice, have significantly reduced force production relative to the young mice. So taken together, these data do indeed suggest the hypothesis that diaphragm motor unit loss, thereby resulting in reduced diaphragm muscle mass and function, could be a cause of death in supercentenarians. And as I mentioned, Tony beautifully laid out this hypothesis with data, so if you're interested in that, I'd recommend checking out his video. But I'd like to add, I think I can add to this story. And what I think I can add is that if we escape all major diseases, this may not be an aberration to Maria. This may be coming for all of us, because neurodegeneration and respiratory failure may be a likely cause of death. And to illustrate that story, I'm going to look at data for ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, with the best example of that being Stephen Hawking, as shown here, who was diagnosed with and lived with ALS for about 55 years, which is like a crazy record that anybody could live with ALS for that long, because it's generally a quick neurodegenerative process and a relatively quick death. Now, you could say the lifetime probability of contracting or getting ALS is low. It's 1 out of every 347 men, and 1 out of every 436 women are diagnosed with ALS over their lifetimes. So this doesn't look like an age-related disease on its surface, as everybody isn't getting ALS. So then how would ALS, or how does ALS link with aging, especially death via respiratory failure? So first, there are many ALS mechanisms that overlap with hallmarks of aging, which is what we'll see here, including disruption of proteostasis, mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, and neuroinflammation. And respiratory failure is the top cause of death in ALS, which is what we'll see here. So the top cause of death in ALS is not cancer or type 2 diabetes or cardiac arrest or having a heart attack, cardiovascular disease. We can see that it's respiratory failure. So then, even without an ALS diagnosis, if we escape all major diseases, neurodegeneration and respiratory failure is a likely cause of death. And to illustrate that point, let's take a look at which biomarkers are linked with neurodegeneration. So neurofilament light chain, which I'm going to refer to as NFL, is a biomarker of axonal injury, which precedes neurodegeneration, which is what we'll see here in this image of a neuron. So when there is injury to the axon, as shown there, neurofilaments are released, which can then be detected in the blood as a biomarker of neurodegeneration. Now, serum levels of NFL are 2 times higher in ALS patients when compared with controls. That's what we'll see here. On the y-axis, we've got serum levels of NFL, and that's plotted against controls on the left and ALS, people who are diagnosed with ALS on the right. And you can see that these are relatively young subjects, 68 years for the controls and 58 years for the ALS patients. And what we can see is that 2-fold higher average level of serum levels of NFL in the ALS patients when compared with controls, with average levels in the controls just around 20 picograms per mil, and we can see it's approximately double that in the ALS patients. Now, what I'd also like to highlight is the highest levels of NFL in the ALS patients, which are around, in 2 patients, around 110 picograms per mil. So keep these data in mind, 20, 40, and 110. So I mentioned that even without an ALS diagnosis, and I'm going to say this a few times, if we escape all major diseases, neurodegeneration and respiratory failure is a likely cause of death. So why is that? Well, NFL increases during aging, which is what we'll see here. And I'm going to use 2 studies to illustrate this point, but there are many that show an age-related increase for serum levels or circulating levels in blood for NFL. On the y-axis, we've got serum levels of neurofilament light chain, or NFL, and that's plotted against age. And then when looking at the median levels of NFL during aging, the yellow line, we can see that there's an age-related increase. At younger ages, we can see that values for NFL, and these are in non-ALS patients. These are in generally healthy population, not ALS patients. So we can see that in the generally healthy population, in young people, serum NFL levels are generally low. Even at the upper end of the range, they're around 8 or so picograms per mil, which is a very low level. But then in 65-year-olds, we can see that the highest level of NFL is higher, somewhere around 25 picograms per mil. Still not as high as what we find in ALS, average values, but nonetheless, you can see that the data moves in the wrong direction. What I also didn't indicate is that the median levels in this study of up to 65-year-olds was 10 picograms per mil in the 65-year-olds. So again, this is lower than what we'd expect to find in ALS. Note that the study only goes up to 65-year-olds. The name of this channel is ConquerAging or Die Trying, not Get to 65 and Die, right? It's super longevity. I'm sure many of you watching are interested in super longevity, just like me. Which then raises the question, what is the predicted NFL for people greater than 100 years? So the plot shown here is not a linear model, but they did have a linear model in this paper. When looking at the linear model, the linear regression equation for how NFL would be predicted to change during aging within the 20 to 65 year age range for the people in this study, If we know age and sex, so male or female, we can come close to predicting circulating levels of NFL. Now, I get that this regression equation is trained based on data up to 65 years. So the data I'm going to show now is extrapolation beyond that, which may lose accuracy. So this is speculative. I want to be very clear. This is not definitive. This is speculative. Ideally, we'd have a population that includes people way up to 120 years, everybody quantifying NFL. Then we can look at the regression equation, and then we can see what it would truly be. But that data doesn't exist as far as I know. So in terms of the average NFL in a 106-year-old, when plugging in 106 for age and 1 for a man, and you can enter these data if you're a woman, it should be similar or in the same ballpark. The average NFL for a 106-year-old using this equation would be 40 picograms per mil, which is the average ALS value. Now, would that result in neurodegeneration to the point where we would die in our sleep from respiratory failure? I'm not sure. But that 106-year-olds could have NFL levels as high as the average value found in ALS. This is potentially bad news for neurodegeneration at very old ages. So let's take this a step further. Let's assume that we break the human longevity record of 122 years and get far beyond that, say 148 years or around 150. Well, when plugging that number into the regression equation, the average NFL level would be 110 picograms per mil, which is close to the highest value found in ALS. Now, would that reproduce full-blown ALS where we'd have to be in a wheelchair for life? I don't know, but it can't be good for neurodegeneration and the ability to breathe via innervation, a loss of motor units. So this is just one study. Let's see if other studies come to a similar conclusion or not. So that's what we'll see here. On the y-axis, we've got, again, NFL plotted against age, and now the age range goes up to 85 years. But we can see, again, that NFL increases during aging, with average values in the 85-year-olds around 25 picograms per mil. Now, again, that's not 40 picograms per mil, but note that these data only go up to 85 years, which then raises the question, what is the predicted NFL for people older than 100 years? So here too, fortunately, they included a regression equation, and for their regression equation, it didn't include sex, so male or female, but it did include age. So if we know age, we can predict NFL levels, and again, note that these data should be most precise or close to precise within the 20 to 85 year age range. Again, what I'm doing is extrapolation and speculation beyond that range, so the regression equation may not completely hold. So it's just a ballpark figure, but it could be close to accurate. So when entering data for 104 years old, average NFL levels using the regression equation would be 40 picograms per mil. Again, the average value found in ALS patients, potentially without an ALS diagnosis. And these data are similar to the values that we saw in the study on the left, 106 years old, to get to values that are close to average for what's found in ALS patients. All right, what about going beyond 104 years, quote unquote super longevity? Well, if we can get to 135 years, NFL levels based on this regression equation, the study on the right, would be 110 picograms per mil. Again, this is the highest level that was shown for NFL levels in ALS patients. This can't be good for neurodegeneration status at very old ages, which then goes back to this initial premise of, even without an ALS diagnosis, if we escape all major diseases, neurodegeneration and respiratory failure may be a cause of death for those of us who are interested in not just longevity, but super longevity. All right, so this is the story of what is, but what can we do about it? Can we track neurofilament light chain? And we can. This is ultralabtests.com. They do include this biomarker. I'm not sure if other blood testing companies include it, but it's pretty expensive. For just one biomarker, $637 per test. And for someone like me who's already spending somewhere in that ballpark 8 times per year, this prices me out. Now, I'd like to pitch an idea. I can do this test, but I can't afford to do it on my own. If the community, if all of you would like to crowdfund this, I'd be happy to measure this with each of my 8 blood tests per year, and then at the end of that year, report back on aspects of diet that may be correlated with neurofilament light chain. So to potentially get that process started, I'll put in the pinned comment, and if we get a lot of upvotes, maybe I'll make a crowdfunding where we can crowdfund this, and I'd be happy to include this for every blood test going forward. If not, no worries, there may be another way to track neurofilament light chain levels. And that's by looking at diacylglycerides or diglycerides, not triglycerides. Triglycerides are a glycerol backbone bound to 3 fatty acids. Diglycerides are a glycerol backbone bound to 2 fatty acids. And diglycerides have been shown to be significantly associated with circulating levels of NFL, at least in ALS patients, with the strongest association between those two, diglycerides on the y-axis, plotted against NFL on the x in ALS patients, for the diglyceride that has oleic acid, 18,1:18,1. So what we can see from this plot is that this diglyceride that contains oleic acid is significantly correlated with circulating levels of NFL in ALS patients. In other words, when this diglyceride is higher, that was significantly correlated or associated with higher levels of NFL. And when levels of these diglyceride were lower, levels of NFL were correspondingly lower. Again, these are correlations. This is not causation. I just want to make that point abundantly clear. Now, in this study, this wasn't the only diglyceride that was significantly associated with NFL. There were others, 6 others, as shown here. So on the left, we've got those specific diglyceride species, and then we can see when looking at their adjusted p-values, each had an adjusted p-value less than 0.05, so they were higher in ALS patients when compared with healthy controls. In terms of how much higher, we'll take a look at the log FC. That's the log 2-fold change value. Now, for those who may be unfamiliar with statistics, on its face, it may look like the DG 18,1:18,1 is 4.2-fold higher in ALS patients when compared with controls. But no, this is a log scale. This is a base 2 log scale. So that's actually 18 times higher in the ALS patients when compared with the healthy controls. And when looking at the log 2 FC value for the lowest log FC value, which was 2.62, that's 6 times higher in the ALS patients when compared with the healthy controls. So for the 7 diglycerides that are on this list, they were 6 to 18 times higher in ALS patients when compared with healthy controls, and one of them is significantly correlated with neurofilament light chain. These diglycerides can be tracked, which means they can potentially optimize. Now, will that slow neurodegeneration? I don't know. But for someone like me who's interested in super longevity, if I can keep diglycerides low, and that's a part of any mechanisms that are involved in keeping NFL low, I'm going to do that. To track diglycerides, I've been using at-home metabolomics using Iolo's kit as shown here, which includes data for ALS-associated diglycerides, but also 600 other metabolites. Now, I prefer the raw data from Iolo, but there may be others who prefer data grouped into categories, and Iolo also does that as shown here by grouping the data into 19 categories. So if you want to use this kit, discount link in the video's description. All right, so what's my data for these ALS-associated diglycerides? First, though, which of these ALS-associated diglycerides can be tracked? So of the 7 that were on the list, Iolo's kit includes 4 of them, including DG 18,1:18,1, which had the strongest correlation of those 7 diglycerides with NFL. Now, to quantify this over time, I think it makes sense to sum levels of these 4. If we had all 7 diglycerides, it would be even better. But to sum levels of these 4 diglycerides, when considering that they're all higher in ALS in association with neurodegeneration, to sum them and track year-to-year change and try to keep year-to-year change as low as possible. So that's what we'll see here with the sum of these 4 ALS-associated diglycerides on the y-axis plotted against time from 2023 to 2025, as I have 20 tests over that period. I have test number 21. I'm waiting on those data. So when I first started tracking, over 5 tests in 2023, average levels of these 4 diglycerides, 4.1 micromolar. In 2024, over 9 tests, a bit better at 3.7 micromolar. And thus far, after the first 6 tests in 2025, again, I'm waiting on results for test number 7, and I'm going to send another for test number 8, so we'll have a bit more data. Average diglyceride levels for these 4, 3.9 micromolar. In terms of what's optimal, very debatable. At worst, I'd say lower is better, especially when considering that higher levels of diglycerides are associated with higher levels of neurofilament light chain. But how low, nobody knows. So I'm aiming for my lowest levels, and then on the other side, resisting an age-related increase, especially if higher levels are involved in mechanisms related to neurodegeneration. Now, as a side note, if you're familiar with the channel, diglycerides shouldn't be a new topic. They shouldn't be a new metabolite species. They're associated with all-cause or an increased all-cause mortality risk, and if you missed that video, I'll link to it in the right corner. So these data then raise a few questions. Which interventions reduce NFL and or diglycerides? Now, the obvious would be exercise training, because if we regularly exercise, we'd expect to have more motor units or slow the loss of motor units during aging. Neurodegeneration would be a part of that process. So exercise training potentially slowing the neurodegeneration, potentially slowing circulating levels of NFL, potentially having lower levels of triglycerides. That seems like the obvious story. But there may be other mechanisms, so I'm going to do deep dives in future videos, so stay tuned for that. Also, are there other biomarkers related to NFL or neurodegeneration that we can track? NFL may be one measure, but if there are other measures that we can track, either directly, that are direct markers of neurodegeneration, or indirectly that are associated with NFL or other neurodegeneration biomarkers, that may be wise to track over time. And just as a heads up before making that video, there are some. Cystatin C is linked with NFL, kynurenine divided by tryptophan, and acylcarnitines. If you've ever wondered what's optimal for biomarkers, we'll have a new Patreon tier dedicated specifically to that. It currently includes the 35 biomarkers shown here, more than 2 hours of video content, 52 published references, and these aren't the reference ranges. This is what may be optimal based on how each of these biomarkers changes during aging and or associations with all-cause mortality risk in the largest studies that exist. So if you're interested in that, check it out. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon, where I offer blood test consults and also post at least twice per day in 4 other Patreon tiers. We've also got a whole bunch of discount and affiliate links that you can use to test yourself that help support the channel, including ultralabtest.com, which is where I get the majority of my blood tests done, the clearly filtered water filter, which I use every day, Iola's metabolomic kit, as mentioned in the video, oral microbiome composition, NAD testing with Ginfinity, epigenetic testing with True Diagnostic, at-home blood testing with SciFox Health, which includes the best epigenetic test of epigenetic tests, GrimAge, green tea, which I drink every day, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, including Data is my North Star, Figuring Stuff Out is my drug, which I've got on here, and the ConquerAging or Diet Trying logo, link in the video's description. Thanks for watching. Hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.